Hi, I'm Keith, and I'm here with Rob Spaulding. And Rob is the director at the Christian Center in town. And we always, when we talk, we have such great conversations.
Yeah,
one of the things that you deal with a great deal is when you're dealing with the homeless population, there's a whole segment of the population that kind of feels ill at ease, and they don't know what to do, and they don't know how to engage. You're so natural, and because you're surrounded with the homeless population, that I want to pick your brain about this. So how do we engage the homeless population, not just in a static setting such as the Christian Center, but on the street? And can we do that? Is that even practical?
No, I think it is very much. And one of the things, kind of to your first point, was that there's a lot of people who want to be engaged and they want to be a part of helping the homeless and helping the poor. And I think one of the roles that we have to play is to take all of that kind of that scary situation, and we have to move it down to a shelf that everyone can reach and understand.
Wow.
And understand that it's accessible to everyone and that everyone can actually participate in some fashion. And I think, one of the things that we go by, and I think one of the basic things that we can do, honestly, is just to acknowledge people who are living on the street or who are, and I don't mean just somebody who approaches you, but just to acknowledge that there's another human there. And a thing that's happened to me a couple times, it's even happened to me in our little county of 130,000 people, is that because of the isolation, the long-term isolation that a lot of homeless people will go through, and that many people will walk past them, and no one will ever speak and no one will ever engage with them. And this has happened to me on two occasions, but once just in our own community about 2 years ago, we had a guy that was hanging out in front of our chapel, and this story I tell a lot, but he was hanging out in front of our chapel, and I saw him 2 or 3 days in a row, and finally I got an opportunity to walk down, and I just walked down, I sat next to the guy and just engaged him, how are you today, and have you eaten today, and those kinds of questions that you ask, and I'm just kind of, just chatting away. And then very slowly he kind of turns and he looks at me and he says, "Can you see me?" People had walked by him and ignored him so long that he was starting to question whether he existed or whether he was invisible. And I think that's powerful when we think about another human who is down on their luck, whether it be through their choices or through mental illness or whatever unemployment or a life that's unraveled. Or we'll see people whose lives have unraveled because their marriage falls apart and they lose their home, and suddenly they're on the street. And then to just be marginalized to the point where they're not even seen anymore really does begin to have a psychological effect on people. Oh. And this has happened to me once here and once in New York, where somebody has literally looked at me and asked me if I saw them.
Yeah.
So.
Because there is that sense of invisibility when you're ignored and marginalized for so long. And you talk about, we all have these voices inside of our heads, okay, that start to talk to us every once in a while. And I know there's a medicine for that as well, but this is just normal voices, okay?
Right.
Where we're just wrestling with where you're at. You mentioned how quickly this can happen too. A set of circumstances suddenly compels a person out of the comfort zone of suburban America and into homelessness.
Yeah, it's really frightening. I met a guy once who had married a couple of kids. He was married, had a couple of children. He'd been a recovering alcoholic for several years. His wife is killed in a car accident. Through that trauma, he returns to his addiction, which was alcohol. Because of the alcohol, he lost his job. Because he lost his job, he lost his home. Because he lost his home, he lost his children. I mean, when you think about how fast things could unravel, and like we talked earlier, is once you hear someone's story, it's hard to judge them. Yeah. It's very difficult to judge a person.
You use that term unravel, and it's just like that yarn on a sweater that you start to pull, and it's all put together by that tension of the threads that are holding it together, and it pulls out and it all unravels.
Right.
You mentioned this, and one of the phrases that I oftentimes say is that, and it's not original with me, so if somebody notices where it comes from, but every number and the statistics on homelessness, all too well, but every number has a name, and every name has a story, and every story matters to God.
Thank you.
And when you start thinking about that, and you recognize that these stories, that lets them have reality.
Right.
They're no longer invisible.
Right.
I joke because my wife accuses me of being able to pull up to a McDonald's and get the conversation and get the story from somebody from the time the squawk box to the window. And I remember walking into a Starbucks one time, and I'm of the impression that anybody who goes through and gets a tattoo, I don't have any tattoos because I don't like pain. Okay. But anybody who's willing to get a tattoo and endure that pain, every tattoo has a story.
And they're dying for you to ask.
They're dying. They really are.
Yeah.
They may not act like it, but they really are. And I was there at Starbucks one time, and the young lady, a girl whose life was on her sleeve, literally in this case, because she reached out her hand to serve me, and there was a semicolon on her wrist. And that semicolon means that she had attempted suicide and not died. Wow. And I said, "You want to tell me about that?" And she clocks out, comes over the table, clocks out of her work. I don't even know that she talked with her boss. She was just ready to tell the story. And you look at that, and
someone wasn't going to get their $7 latte on time.
That's right. And that's okay. But here's the deal is you deal with a population that has a lot of signs of wear and tear on their lives.
Right.
And it may be a story about a pair of shoes, that a guy that's on the street and he's got a new pair of shoes on, and you want to hear the story behind the new pair of shoes.
Absolutely.
And so, every story that you can unveil gives them their humanity back.
Right. Because really it's more, it's acknowledging and engaging. And I realize there's got to be boundaries there. I mean, especially in unsafe situation or women, things like that. We have to have boundaries in all those. But at the end of the day, to hear someone's story is really powerful. And because you have no idea. I was volunteering on what they called the relief bus in New York once, New York City Relief, and it's just a traveling soup kitchen that drives around the city and just feeds people.
Feeds people.
And there was a church in the South Bronx, and I'd love to go up in that neighborhood, and it was called Love Gospel Mission. Right, I mean, it was everything you could imagine. Right there in the worst neighborhood, one of the worst neighborhoods in America. And each time I would work with them, I would see this guy who looked like this prototypical homeless person, and so. I was always just I want to hear this guy's story. I want to hear this guy's story. And so one day I'm serving on the truck, and we had a couple of extra volunteers, and I asked somebody, I said, "Come over here, and would you serve food?" And so I can go out and just kind of mingle with these people. And so I came out, and I walked over to him, and I said, can I sit next to you? And he nodded, and I sat next to him, and I just started engaging him. And one of the things that he said, I said, every time I'm here, I see you. And he said, "I see you too."
Whoa!
Which reminds us that the power of our engagement is multiplied every time we go back.
Yes.
Every time we return, whether it's working in a soup kitchen or whatever. And he says, "I see you too." And then I started talking to him and where he grew up, and he grew up there in New York, and was telling me his story. And then he began to just open up this story about being a child in New York with an alcoholic, abusive father and an alcoholic mother, and growing up in what we would think of as just this chamber of horrors. And then I remember walking away, just very emotional. I remember walking away and thinking, of course he's homeless. Of course his life is in tatters. He never had a chance. And when you realize that, suddenly this guy that looks like a prototypical homeless person you see, what I saw was a child. I saw a 6-year-old.
Oh, yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And I think that's really, that's what that story means. I mean, I think that's what it brings.
You see with a whole different set of eyes. And you know what? Judgment turns to compassion.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean pity.
No.
And I think pity is the worst thing we can extend. It turns to compassion instead of judgment. That is so powerful, Rob.
Yeah.
And you know what? You talk about this because now, even with the boundaries, and I appreciated you inserting that in there.
Sure.
Even with having the appropriate boundaries, it gives us a tool just to engage the conversation with someone and let them know that we see them.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. That is powerful. That is
Thank you.
powerful.